After the bleak shadows of the Dark Ages, Italy lit up the world. Emerging from the devastation of the Black Death, Italy heralded the rebirth of invention, spectacle, and the triumph of humanism. It saw an explosion of breathtaking new ideas, explored by some of the greatest minds of all time.
Filippo Brunelleschi was the ingenio, the ingenious man.
It produced some of the greatest works of architecture, art, and engineering in the history of the Western world.
The enterprise of Renaissance engineering is recovering this ancient knowledge.
I don't think that any other period in the history of Western civilization can brag to having produced so much genius.
But achieving such genius was a struggle, as builders combated natural disasters, repressive church dogma, and each other.
And the Italian peninsula becomes the cockpit, the fighting point.
This was the age of mercurial architects, and it witnessed the new feeling that nothing was impossible. In 476 AD, the Roman Empire collapsed, ending its period of dominion over the world. The emperors who ruled and shaped the lives of millions of people had died or been killed, and Western Europe had become fractured and disparate. For centuries afterwards, Europe was dominated by a dynasty of Teutonic rulers whose domains were known collectively as the Holy Roman Empire. But by the 12th century, a loose patchwork of Italian republics was taking shape into a cohesive entity. Together, they would recover the past glory of Rome, revitalize Europe, and engineer the blueprint for the modern Western world.
Hi, I'm Peter Weller. And in 2001, I came here to the city of Florence to finish a master's degree in Italian Renaissance art history at Syracuse University in Florence. The Italian Renaissance is as overwhelmingly mind-blowing as it is beautiful. It is the most impacting epoch of the last millennium. It is the age of invention with Da Vinci and Copernicus and Gutenberg, but it is also the age of the cult of personality. It is the time when that unknown artisan or craftsman will become the artist. It is the time when that nameless builder will become the architect.
In the 12th and 13th centuries, Italy is really beginning this sort of rebirth. Because what's happening is that stability has been reinstituted onto the peninsula, mainly through the Holy Roman Empire, through the system that we call feudalism. The city is reborn.
From these newly liberated cities, a new kind of leader emerged.
The rulers of the Italian city-states are the merchants. They're not the traditional aristocracy. They're not the traditional nobles. And this produces this extraordinarily vibrant urban life in the 13th century.
Great dynastic families, like the Medici, went from running banks and businesses to ruling entire city-states. Wealth brought power, and power could commission works of art and architecture. These once small towns soon began to build on a massive scale, always with an eye to outdoing their neighbors, as well as maintaining their independence and individuality.
The foundation for the Renaissance is the city. Everything that happens in the Renaissance, from art, architecture, engineering, literature, all the things that go on depend upon the city.
One ambitious city that sought to influence this new age was a republic situated on the important trade route between France and Rome. This was Siena.
I come here to the Piazza del Campo once a year to witness that medieval harangue on horseback around here called Palio. 3 times around this Campo, 90 seconds of speed and violence on bareback horses. When the horses run, they pass this magnificent 15th century sculpted fountain called the Fonte Gaia by Jacopo della Quercia. Now today, when we turn on a tap, we just take it for granted that H2O is going to come out. But the Sienese needed this fountain because when they were making all this loot, prosperity begets a city jam-packed with people. And more people demands, as we have seen with Persia, with Carthage, with Rome, with the Maya, more water.
But providing sufficient water for this burgeoning city was a massive undertaking.
Siena doesn't have a river very close, so they had to find this water somewhere else. They thought they could find another way to go and search for water. And that way was building some tunnels underground.
By digging a network of underground tunnels called bottini, the workers could tap into the natural springs and groundwater reserves that surrounded Siena. Slowly, the water seeped through the ground into these narrow tunnels and then into holding tanks. Excavating these bottini was no easy task. The diggers used shovels, picks and chisels to chip away at the calcite deposits in the tunnel, working in dark, dusty conditions, often unable to stand upright.
A bottino like this one would sometimes run for miles and miles, so the engineers had to know just where in the heck they were going. So every so often they dug a hole up to the surface, and these holes were called occhi, or eyes. It would give the engineer a sense of where the direction of the bottino would be, and if they were wrong, they could redirect the bottino.
The water ran through the barrel-shaped tunnels, flowing into densely populated parts of the city where it was needed most, and coursing underneath the busy streets into the fountains around Siena, like the Fonte Gaia.
Now these channels had to be pitched at an angle ever so slight, imperceptible to the naked eye, less than 1 degree, because if the water flowed too steeply, it would overwhelm the system. So to keep this from happening, the engineers used an instrument called an archipendolo. It's nothing but a pendulum. It's a stick with a string and a weighted ball or stone at the end. No matter how much you pitch the stick, the string will always remain vertical, giving you a vertical line in a relationship to the tilt of the horizontal stick. In this way, the water would flow quietly and evenly into Siena and fill up the Fonte Gaia.
By the year 1345 AD, over 10 miles of tunnels were functioning underneath bustling Siena. As a result, the city continued to grow and prosper.
More water brought more people to the boomtown. More people to the boomtown, more turf is needed. Pretty soon, Siena controls most of southern Tuscany. Now, this prosperity and this land encroachment, if you will, would seriously become the burr in the saddle to one of its neighbors.
Florence and Siena are the two dominant republics in Tuscany.
It was a rivalry on all levels. Economic, political, artistically. And in the 13th century, the city-state of Siena, in all three of these categories, was probably Florence's superior.
The two republics went at each other hammer and tongs until Siena delivered its rival a punishing blow at the Battle of Monteperti.
Siena fights Florence. And to put it bluntly, Siena kicks ass. Florence goes home in humiliation and defeat, but guess what? That ain't gonna be for long.
The brilliant hydraulic engineering that made Siena strong couldn't sustain it through one of the worst calamities Europeans ever suffered.
In 1347, the Black Death struck. And according to the eminent humanist writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the Black Death, the disease killed so fast that you could lunch with your friends and dine with your ancestors in heaven. One conservative estimate is that Siena lost over 60% of its population in a matter of months. One thing is for certain, after the Black Death, Siena would never be a major player again on the stage of early modern Italy.
That singular event probably marks the end of Siena's role on a kind of international scene, and it also marks the beginning of Florence's rise to power.
Siena was laid low. Its decline would leave the door open for its arch-rival Florence to step into the vacuum and engineer its own golden age. This culminated in the creation of one of the most magnificent monuments of the early Renaissance, a building thought by everyone except the obsessed architect to be structurally impossible. In the 13th and 14th centuries, cities formed the centers of political power in Italy, but Florence was in a class of its own. Its ruling oligarchy was thriving. Economics and culture gained over religion and piety. Man and his potential were taking center stage. This revolutionary philosophy was called humanism.
Humanism, quite simply, is an interest in the ancient world. In Italy, all you had to do was look around at the ancient ruins and understand how great man had been in the ancient world. It was all there. If we could imitate that building, if we could take the principles of that building and apply it to our buildings, then we'd have something really remarkable.
When the Black Death struck Europe in 1347, Florence was not immune. Almost half the city's population was wiped out. It took the region more than half a century to recover, but the recovery itself was dazzling. It was called the Renaissance, which means literally rebirth or revival. Throughout Tuscany, a patrician class of enormously rich families used their fortunes to commission magnificent projects on behalf of the people they governed.
There is an appetite among those who survive to enjoy life, to do other things, to understand or to sense that the life is to be exploited in some way for those who are alive.
The Medici clan of Florence, one of the wealthiest families in Italy, led the way in re-establishing the glory of the ancients. They transformed their city into the new Athens.
The structure of patronage has changed. Patrons are using artists and architects to celebrate themselves.
The focus of the enterprise was the construction of the cathedral in the heart of Florence.
They've never seen a structure that looks like the one they want to build. Right? That's a matter of ambition, of idea.
See that big old church behind me with that scaffolding on it? It's called Santa Maria del Fiore, otherwise known as the Duomo, or Cathedral of Florence. It was built by a guy named Arnolfo da Cambio around 1200s, but you know what? He was dead before it was ever finished. Arnolfo intended for the church to have a dome, but he's dead, so the church stands for a whole bunch of decades without any dome on it at all. Finally, in the 1400s, it's left up to a guy wearing a real genius suit named Filippo Brunelleschi to not only change the entire idea of building to become an architect, but to make the entire field of architecture a design.
Brunelleschi had grown up in a middle-class family and was expected to become a government official like his father. But Brunelleschi Jr. was more interested in art and design, and first he became a master goldsmith.
It's only in his early 30s that he then moved over and began to become what we now call an architect.
Now, Brunelleschi is a maverick and he's brash. His dad is a notary. Brunelleschi wants to study sculpture. Wonder how his dad reacted to that one, huh? Probably like my old man reacted when I told him I wanted to go to New York and become an actor. In any case, by his early 20s, Brunelleschi is a pretty fair goldsmith. Now, in 1401, the baptistry decides it wants to replace its doors, so they hold a competition. Competition comes down to two guys, Brunelleschi and the international Gothic man of the hour, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Brunelleschi was pretty good, but he ain't no Ghiberti. Ghiberti wins, Brunelleschi runs away with his tail between his legs, humiliated in defeat.
He loses the competition to Ghiberti in 1401. And it sets up the kind of perfect opportunity for him to leave the city of Florence, then go to Rome and study the secrets of the ancients.
Brunelleschi spent at least 10 years studying in Rome, examining in depth the remaining examples of Roman engineering.
Renaissance Italians are fascinated with the way Romans did everything, the way things were done in ancient Rome, and building is no exception. A big part of the enterprise of Renaissance engineering is recovering this ancient knowledge.
One temple in particular made a lasting impression on the young Brunelleschi, the Pantheon. Had the Romans found out how to build a great dome without the need for complicated wooden scaffolding? The dome spans 142 feet. Over 2 painstaking decades, he probably examined every inch in an attempt to understand how it was made. When Brunelleschi returned to Florence, he may have brought with him all the secrets of Roman dome construction.
It seems that Brunelleschi reappears in Florence just at the time that the opera of the cathedral was in fact planning on this competition for the design of the dome. The cathedral was to be, upon completion, the largest church in all of Christianity.
It would turn out to be one of the largest building challenges ever mounted in Renaissance Italy.
They were building it large to sort of show the world exactly how important this city was on all levels. The problem was that they were setting themselves up for a big fall.
Brunelleschi proposed a method that made him the object of widespread ridicule. His design for the dome lacked the traditional use of flying buttresses, wooden supports, and all internal scaffolding.
General public opinion was that Brunelleschi had gone very simply mad. They also began to realize that no one else seems to have any clearer picture of how to pull this thing off, and so they began gradually to sort of heed his words.
Brunelleschi managed to persuade the judges of the merit of his unique design. But much to his dismay, the commission was granted to him with one infuriating stipulation.
It seems that fate would rear its ugly head because he would have to share that role with his nemesis, Lorenzo Ghiberti.
Brunelleschi would not only have to succeed in creating his great dome, he would also have to engineer his rival's departure. On the 7th of August 1420, after a celebration breakfast of bread, melon and Trebbiano wine eaten on top of the cathedral walls, serious building got underway.
What Brunelleschi decides to do is to construct not one dome, but two. Okay? A dome within a dome.
When standing inside the cathedral, people would be able to marvel at the beautifully decorated internal dome. But from the outside, the second would also have an extra functional purpose.
He would use that second shell to protect the inner dome from rain, but at the same time to make the entire structure look more gonfia et magnifica, more swollen and magnificent.
Marble rib vaults were installed at every angle of the octagonal dome to give the shells a structural foundation. Then rows of arches were built to intersect the ribs at 90-degree angles. But Brunelleschi faced an enormous logistical problem, which was to find a way to lift tons of material up to a height of 200 feet.
And so Brunelleschi devises something we call the ox hoist.
2 oxen yoked to a tiller turned a vertical shaft to raise or lower the hoist. The stroke of genius was a screw that changed gear from forward to reverse and the direction from up to down. This meant the oxen didn't need to be taken out of harness and turned around. They could keep pacing in the same direction to both raise and lower the hoist, a saving of several hours every day. By the end of the project, it had lifted an estimated 35,000 tons of building material. But the stone that had been lifted still had to be moved laterally and set in place hundreds of feet up in the air. To accomplish this seemingly impossible task, Brunelleschi designed a second entirely new kind of hoist, which he called a castello.
The castello was a crane that they used to move weights horizontally.
Fixed high on the cupola, it had a crossbeam and a counterweight. This allowed the operator, dangerously perched on a small platform at the top of the crane, to place material with minuscule precision.
These are the machines that he was introducing, and these are the machines that made it possible for such a dome to have been built.
But all this creative thinking still didn't solve the fundamental problem of making such a huge dome with no internal supporting scaffold. Brunelleschi still needed to calculate how to prevent it from collapsing inwards. It would demand the greatest leap of his imagination, combined with a lot of hard number crunching, to save his beloved dome from disaster. Florence, Italy, 1420 AD. The visionary architect and engineer Filippo Brunelleschi had been commissioned to construct the most magnificent dome in the world, the cupola of Santa Maria del Fiore. He needed to prevent it from collapsing on account of the absence of internal support in his design.
Now, it's one thing to invent a clutch and a flywheel, and you got the donkey only going in one direction, saves a lot of time, and then you invent a crane, it brings the stuff up high. But the more important question is, I'm standing on top of this dome, and how did Brunelleschi keep this sucker from caving in?
He had to find a way to keep the bricks in place and support the bed joints of the masonry. The solution? An ingenious bricklaying technique that relied on the precise use of angles, correct placement, and friction.
Brunelleschi comes up with this invention, if you will, from Rome, which they use decoratively, but we don't know that they use it functionally, of herringbone bricks. You have a short brick here that's sort of bookended by two long bricks, and subsequently you have weight coming down, then weight coming down, and then weight coming across, and then weight coming down, and then weight coming across. The whole point of it is that a herringbone pattern will displace the weight out and down instead of just directly down, where you might have a collapse of your dome.
To solve the opposite problem of bricks bursting outwards, Brunelleschi laid a series of wooden chains horizontally around the octagonal circumference of the dome.
They were going to construct these so-called catene, or these horizontal chains that were intended to maintain the hoop stress or the lateral thrust of the dome.
5 chains were to be interlocked at regular intervals to support the dome and serve as invisible buttressing. All this time, Brunelleschi was forced to supervise the project with his co-engineer and rival, Ghiberti, breathing down his neck. At that moment, with the material for the chains pouring in, he seized the opportunity to move Ghiberti out.
In August of 1423, Brunelleschi called in sick. Ghiberti rather reluctantly then begins the direction of the placement of these wooden chains. And as soon as Brunelleschi heard that the process had begun, he miraculously recovers, inspects the quality of Ghiberti's work, and criticizes it publicly, saying they would have to undo everything he had done.
Ghiberti having been sufficiently humiliated, Brunelleschi was declared the head of the project for life. On the 30th of August, 1436, after 16 years of intensive work, the largest masonry dome in the world was complete. But Brunelleschi's career was far from over. Even before the completion of the Duomo, he had been experimenting with perspective and mathematical proportion. Although his structures appeared simple and straightforward, there were spatial games being played in them. And one of his most brilliant innovations was a concept that is still a cornerstone of engineering today: single-point perspective. By contemplating this 8-sided baptistry and the other buildings surrounding it, Brunelleschi realized that if he placed 3-dimensional buildings on a 2-dimensional plane, they would disappear at a finite point, called the vanishing point. The theory of perspective, which is that the apparent size of an object decreases with increasing distance from the eye, would transform the entire worldview of artists and architects around the world and allow the concept of the blueprint to emerge.
What it does in architecture is change the game all the way through Frank Lloyd Wright and to Frank Gehry today. Because architecture is no more just building. It isn't figuring it out in the dirt and saying, hey, if this wall is that long, we got to make the spire that high. Now they can deduce it and put it on paper. It's no longer the builder who's in control, it's the architect.
Before Brunelleschi, most projects were based on approximate models. This would come to an end when Brunelleschi began this practice of what we call paper architecture, and that is clearly indicating what his plans were, and then begins the sort of modern tradition of architecture today.
Brunelleschi's radical new designs were put to the test in 1442 during his work on the Pazzi Chapel.
Now this building behind me is the chapter house for the Church of Santa Croce, a Franciscan church. It's called the Pazzi Chapel. I'm going to talk to a man I'm a little nervous talking to. He's one of my own professors from Syracuse University, Dr. Rab Hatfield, and he's going to explain why this chapel is distinct from what Brunelleschi was doing before this. Let's go look on the inside.
Let's go see them. It's all about relationships. He's trying to figure out an arrangement of all of these pieces so they all fit together perfectly, just the way the bones all fit together in your body.
Right.
Your Renaissance architect, thanks to the invention of scientific perspective, where they learn how to represent space, and it's Brunelleschi who invents this, learn to see things in 3D, learn to imagine things in 3D.
Filippo Brunelleschi transforms all of architectural design by using Roman elements like this column and pilasters and numerical proportions, integrating them into an elegant and beautiful whole that is never overwhelmed by one of the parts. But he doesn't write it down. It's up to a young guy, the next generation, Leon Battista Alberti. This guy did everything. He wrote about architecture, archaeology, political science, religion, even wrote about horseback riding. He's a pretty good designer and architect himself. Now, everyone starts to read about Alberti, including a very powerful guy at the moment, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. I love that name, Aeneas Silvius. So for all of you guys out there like me having a little bit of a heart attack because your wife just said, honey, let's redecorate, get a load of this. Pius reads Alberti and says, you know, I'd like to do that little Roman thing for the place where I was born. What, the house? No, the whole town.
Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini became Pope Pius II in 1458. By 1459, he had turned his attention to his hometown of Corsignano and commissioned his first attempt at creating the ideal city there.
This is the Tuscan town of Pienza. And this is my friend and a guy who taught me, Rocky Ruggiero from Syracuse University. I want to ask you first, is this the first real Renaissance town that's planned as such?
To come to this backwater town where, you know, population is a couple of 100 people, it kind of gives Pius free rein. So what he does is to create this rather imposing cathedral. And it's that first impression that you get. And then around this particular structure, he will organize all of the other various archetypes.
If this piazza is so perfectly planned with its perfect bishop's palace and its cathedral, why are these streets always crooked? I come up here, I don't know where I'm going.
This is actually done intentionally. One thing they didn't want to do was to let people know how small it was. And so they intentionally keep these streets from forming a direct axis so that you always have a corner that's sort of obstructing your view, and it makes it seem much larger than it actually is.
By the time the transformation was complete in 1464, over 40 public buildings had been erected or refurbished. Each on its own was an important expression of revolutionary ideals, but it was the town as a whole that represented the ideal that the age stood for. And yet, the humanist harmony in Pienza did not last long. The radical new ideas that celebrated mankind and human potential were being challenged by the forces of reactionary Catholicism.
The year is 1492. Not only has Columbus discovered America, but Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, that great patron of the arts in Florence, is dead. But a lot of Florence are sick of the Medicis and their cronyism, and they want the Medici kids run out of town. Plus, they've been listening to the sermons of a small Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who preaches from the pulpit in the Duomo, railing against corruption in both church and state. He advocates a return to a Florentine republic and civic pride and values through piety. Savonarola warns that if Florence doesn't get its house in order, the winds of God's vengeance will blow through the city, and indeed an evil wind is ready to roll all the way through Italy in the form of Charles VIII of France, who wants to reclaim Naples in the name of his country and threatens to sack any Italian town who stands in his way.
Savonarola begins to predict an invasion of some sort. And when it finally comes, he's able to say, you see, I predicted this, I foretold it. He is able to kind of pass himself off as a prophet almost in the Old Testament mode.
Unhappily, Savonarola's dire warnings of invasion all came true. In 1494, Charles VIII, King of France, stood poised on the Tuscan border, ready to rampage through Italy. Still made up of small republics and city-states that were constantly feuding between themselves, Italy was ripe for takeover. Italy's builders had created beautiful monuments that exalted humanity. But in this new era of conflict, they would dedicate their ingenuity to the art of war.
There is no such thing as a trained military engineer. And so it is that your greatest architects of the Renaissance, although sometimes they probably started out knowing nothing about it, were called upon to design the fortifications of major Italian cities.
New technologies were developed specifically for the army. The weapon of choice of Charles VIII was a fearsome new cannon. Medieval walls crumbled under its awesome firepower.
The cannon became much more reliable and also able to launch a projectile that was much larger, heavier, and to launch at a further distance. And so Charles VIII brings these cannon with him over the Alps, and it becomes immediately clear that he can knock down virtually any fortification that he chooses. And this is a terrible thing. I mean, this is a crisis, right? Because all of a sudden you can't hold them off.
The high, thin walls were easily penetrated and destroyed by the new cannon, rendering all Italian cities very vulnerable. The old walls couldn't even support the heavier weight of newly designed weapons intended to repel the invader.
The new cannon had strong percussive powers. You could not put a new cannon on the old medieval wall and fire it because it would shake its own wall down.
The Italian engineers began to put up smaller, more robust walls that would both support the weapons and resist the incoming French cannonball.
This new wall will resist, in fact, these larger guns because it can absorb the impact of the larger projectile.
Engineers also redesigned the base layout of these stouter walls that surrounded the cities.
Military engineers develop an angled wall.
The angled bastions of the star-shaped forts kept attackers at a greater distance, and the angled sides easily rebuffed individual artillery shots.
The cities become star-shaped, and you have the development of these large star plans with angled bastions that project from the city walls with their flanking coverage on either side. The angles create a series of faces. And the faces are very important because the different corners of the city can, as it were, protect one another.
The bastion fort became the model for defensive fortifications in Italy and seized the imagination of military commanders all across Europe. But soon the attention would shift from Florence and Tuscany to an old center of political power that would be reborn through glorious new monuments and amazing feats of engineering. In 15th century Italy, Florence became the center of Renaissance thought, bringing new ideas of architecture, art, and engineering to the region. But Florence soon ceded the accolade back to a former powerhouse of culture, now on the rise again. Italy's center of artistic glory would return to the city-state that once conquered the world, Rome.
In the early 1300s, there's a big beef in Rome about who exactly is Pope. So the rightful Pope supposedly goes off to France. And for the next several decades, the papacy lives in France. Now, by the 1370s, when the popes come back to Rome, Rome is a ghost town. And for the next 100 years or so, all the way through the Renaissance, each pope is successively trying to rebuild Rome. Now, in the 1490s, when the Medici are booted out of Florence, Florence becomes a republic, yeah, but they're broke. And so all these famous cats like Da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo, they split Florence because Florence is no longer happening. If you're a player, the place you want to be is Rome.
Rome had been nothing in the 14th century because the popes had moved out. But they come back in the early 15th century, and from that point on, they began gradually to reorganize the papal state.
One pope in particular ushered in an unprecedented wave of revitalized engineering skills. He was Sixtus V.
Sixtus and the popes who come after him feel the need to turn Rome into an important and impressive capital city, the capital of Christendom.
Sixtus V sort of took it upon himself to re-urbanize the city.
If Rome was going to be the epicenter of the Catholic world again, the city needed an extreme makeover. But re-engineering Rome would prove an epic task. Firstly, Sixtus decided to clean up its mean streets. The city was teeming with violent criminals. The Pope simply had all the miscreants rounded up and executed. The next step was to restore the aqueducts, which represented one of the finest achievements of ancient Roman engineering. When the water returned, the population boomed and the city blossomed. Roads were paved, streets were widened, and all Rome exploded with new construction projects. Sixtus then concocted a master plan for the city, a framework for organizing all future development through the specific placement of grandiose monuments.
One of his particular practices was, in fact, to use the ancient Egyptian obelisks that had been brought to the city by the ancient Romans. These were military trophies that the Romans had brought back in ancient times and had erected throughout the city. We know today that there are more Egyptian obelisks in Rome than in Egypt itself. And how Sixtus used these obelisks was to, in fact, place them as urban exclamation points.
Sixtus wanted to move one of the obelisks to the front of a new cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica, but it weighed in excess of 300 tons.
Moving the obelisk was no easy task.
Sixtus awarded the contract to the architect and engineer Domenico Fontana. His plan appeared feasible on paper, but carrying it out proved almost impossible. To protect the carved stonework, he encased the enormously heavy obelisk in a wooden tower. Iron bars were attached along the edge. The wooden tower had columns extending nearly 100 feet up into the air. Ropes were threaded through the eyes of the iron bars to allow the obelisk to be winched up by windlasses. The plan was to employ a crew of more than 900 men to do the job. Using 40 windlasses, the obelisk was raised gently off the ground and lowered onto a platform of log rollers for relocation to the new site. On the 30th of April, 1586, under the watchful eye of the Pope himself, the crew began the daunting task of moving the obelisk.
When the men were hoisting it up, they were under command to remain silent throughout the whole process, under pain of death, if one of them in fact broke the silence.
Finally, 17 days after they began the heart-stopping operation, the obelisk safely reached its new home, in front of St. Peter's, where it still stands today. News of Rome's extraordinary revitalization spread rapidly throughout Europe. The capital of the ancient world had returned to the forefront of European life, and the age of architects that had begun in Florence had gone on to transform Rome and afterwards all Europe.
Artists of all sorts could create such beauty, such wondrous works of art on the scale of St. Peter's Basilica, like the obelisks that were erected throughout the city of Rome, like the dome of the cathedral in the city of Florence. It gave the human significance again, and it gave us a bit of an attitude as well, that we are again the center of all things. And many people think it is with the Renaissance that modern culture actually begins.
Bella Firenze, beautiful Florence. Well, it looks pretty bella today, but believe me, in 2001, when I was sitting in a freezing apartment down there in the Arno in the middle of the dead of winter, pounding out papers until 4 o'clock in the morning on Botticelli, it didn't feel so bella. Matter of fact, I was just about an inch from getting the bella out of here, going back to my day gig in LA. But I stayed, and I got my degree. And I keep coming back here to Florence and Siena, I don't know, to be of service, to teach a field trip or two, perhaps to sit in on a lecture by one of these brilliant professors who lives here and runs around Tuscany trying to explain how the miracles of the artists and architects of Italy in this period did so much to pull us out of that dark age and illuminate the daylight of our modern world. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.